Hello, my name is Brian Vermeer. I'm an associate professor at the Department of Mechanical, Industrial, and Aerospace Engineering at Concordia University. Today I'm going to be talking to you about a new type of time stepping that we've been working on in my research group. This is called Paired Explicit Runge-Kutta schemes, and specifically I'm going to be talking to you about GPU-accelerated paired explicit Runge-Kutta schemes and their implementation in our solver, HORUS. So the motivation for this research, in my group, I lead the Computational Aerodynamics Lab at Concordia, and what we're interested in is really designing the next generation of commercial aircraft. So we're looking at moving away from things like conventional tube and wing type designs towards less conventional kind of future generation aircraft designs, things like blended wing bodies, distributed propulsion, and electric propulsion. And all of these are focused on improving efficiency, reducing noise, and kind of overall aerodynamic improvements to aircraft to reduce the environmental impacts of aviation. Now what this requires is it requires improved design of not just the full aircraft itself, but also a large number of subcomponents, things like landing gear, high lift configurations, flow control devices, and ultimately, as I mentioned before, transitions towards completely new types of designs such as blended wing bodies. Now, really from an engineering perspective, this is challenging because the types of flows that we deal with in aerospace engineering and aircraft design are typically unsteady, turbulent, and compressible, and the geometries are complex. So for example, the landing gear that I showed on the previous slide, you can see that that's a highly complex geometry. And it turns out that the combination of all of these is a significant challenge for current generation computational fluid dynamics tools. So typically what I'm talking about here is the Reynolds average Navier-Stokes approach, where we solve for the time average of the Navier-Stokes equations. And if you're familiar with kind of conventional CFD, you'll know that this introduces turbulence modeling, or the requirement for turbulence modeling for the unresolved Reynolds stresses. And it turns out that these turbulence models, which are based on some sort of heuristic and experimental correlations, they really struggle, particularly in regions where we're dealing with transition and separated flows. And in aerospace, these kinds of things come up all the time in off-design conditions. In addition, RANS models are typically highly tuned for conventional aircraft designs, things like tube and wing designs. And when we're looking at kind of next generation designs, things like blended wing bodies, it's unclear, this tuning that was done over the last, 30 or 40 years, how that's going to extend. So what's been proposed is to switch away from RANs because of the limitations of current turbulence modeling techniques, and to switch towards scale resolving simulation. So what we're talking about here is things like large eddy simulation and direct numerical simulation. And in LES and DNS, what we're doing is, instead of RANs where we're solving for the time average, in LES and DNS we're solving for an unsteady simulation where we directly resolve most or all of the unsteady turbulent structures in both space and time. So instead of modeling, we're trying to resolve the structures directly, thereby bypassing the limitations of RANS turbulence models. So we're trying to get improved accuracy by resolving the unsteady nature of turbulent flows. Now really the challenge here is that these kinds of scale resolving simulations are orders of magnitude more expensive than RANs. So if a typical RANS simulation, could run on a small scale cluster for a full scale aircraft configuration in, let's say, a few hours, if you're trying to do LES or DNS, you're talking about leadership scale computing capability over weeks or months. So these scale resolving simulations are much more expensive than RANs, and the objective of this work is to really try to reduce that cost. Another thing that's associated with this cost is the use of low-order methods. So in RAN solvers, typically we use second-order finite volume methods. These require a large number of points per wave when we move towards scale resolving simulation. So this means we need a really fine mesh in order to accurately resolve the unsteady structures. In addition, one of the primary challenges is that thin boundary layer elements are locally stiff. So when we look at the flow over an aircraft, the boundary layer region is incredibly thin region that we need to resolve to accurately get things like viscous stresses at the wall. And this thin boundary layer region ends up limiting our maximum time step size because the elements in this region are so small. So overall, the objective of this work, we want to enable industrial scale LES/DNS of complex geometries, things like full aircraft. We want to, in order to do this, we're going to utilize high-order spatial discretizations, specifically the flux reconstruction approach that I'm going to talk about in a minute. And these discretizations need to be suitable for modern hardware architectures, so specifically things like GPUs and massively parallel clusters of CPUs. And really what we're talking about here is the ability to obtain high levels of accuracy as well as have data locality. So when we're talking about parallel computing, being able to maximize the amount of compute that we do locally on a node and minimize the amount of communication that we need to do between nodes. And secondly, we're going to talk about development of novel optimal temporal discretization, so time-stepping schemes that alleviate the time-step limits and reduce computational cost. So as I mentioned, the first thing that we're going to talk about is spatial discretization. So when we talk about designing an aircraft, really what we're talking about is solving the Navier-Stokes equations, which can be cast in the following form, where we have a partial derivative in time of our solution plus the divergence of some flux function. So for example, if we're solving Euler, this flux function is a function of the solution. If we're solving Navier-Stokes, it's a function of the solution and its gradient. Now what we're trying to solve for here is u of x and t. This is our solution as a function of space and time. So for example, in a compressible flow, this is our mass, momentum, and energy. These are our conserved variables. So we rearrange to solve for those. And what we find is that this means we need to do two calculus operations. The first of these is that we need to integrate in time from some initial t equals 0 to some final time. And we also have to compute derivatives, so the divergence of the flux functions in space. So when we're talking about spatial discretizations, what we're really talking about is this divergence operator. And essentially this means how can we approximate derivatives in space? So as I mentioned previously, we're going to use the flux reconstruction approach. What flux reconstruction does is it uses a piecewise local polynomial representation of the solution within each element. So what you can imagine here is we have our computational domain. Let's say it starts here and ends here. And gray is showing the exact solution. So let's say this is our exact initial condition that we want to impose. And from that initial condition, we want to advance this solution forwards in time. Now what we do with FR is we split the domain into a number of elements. So we could create a tessellation, and we represent the solution at a discrete number of points inside of each element. So instead of representing this continuous gray line, we're going to represent the solution at a discrete number of points. These are the blue dots that you see here. And then using those blue dots, we can create a polynomial representation of the solution within each cell. So now we have a finite representation of the data, which can be stored in RAM, for example, the solution at these points. And then we reconstruct the solution in between these points using a polynomial. So this is how we're going to represent the solution in space. Now we also have to represent our flux function. This is the thing we're trying to take the derivative of. So again, from the solution at these points, we can evaluate the flux at these points, and then we can represent that flux within a cell, again, by a polynomial representation. Now the challenge here is that this flux is discontinuous at the interface between cells. This is something that violates continuity. So in order to enforce continuity, what we do is we solve for a common Riemann flux at the interface. So this is just like finite volume, where you use something like an upwind flux, rho, awesome, or HLLC to solve for a common flux. And then using that common flux, we apply a correction function to correct the solution polynomial within each element so that they match at these interfaces. Okay, so this is really kind of a high-level idea of what we're doing with flux reconstruction. Now, once we've got this continuous representation of the flux, this is now conservative, and we can take the divergence of this flux function. Okay, so we've now got a polynomial, and we can take the derivative of a polynomial. It's somewhat somewhat trivial to do that. Now, FR can be extended to any element type, so triangles and quads in 2D, prisms, tets, hexes, and pyramids in 3D. Another thing that's interesting is the polynomial degree determines the order of accuracy. So if we have a polynomial degree of let's say k, the order of accuracy will be at least k plus 1. And this polynomial degree can be arbitrarily large, so this means we can generate any order of accuracy that we want. Another thing that's nice is that it's suitable for mixed element unstructured meshes. So this is appealing when we're talking about complex geometries. We have the ability to use unstructured meshes, different element types, and still maintain high order accuracy. Something just as a note here is that the polynomial degree can actually be adapted. So here's an example of a simulation where the polynomial degree is represented on the top animation. So white is P1 and dark red is P5. So here we're going from a second to sixth order accuracy simulation. And on the bottom, you can see the vorticity contours showing as these vortices get shed, we can do things like track local flow features with the polynomial degree. So this polynomial degree can also be dynamic. So when we compare flux reconstruction to other discretizations, so one advantage it has over the finite difference method is the finite difference method is not suitable for unstructured grids, and this kind of limits its applicability to complex geometries. If we compare FR to the finite element method, well, the finite element method doesn't have what's called an explicit form, so this means that in the finite element method, everything is globally coupled, which means that you need to use or are restricted to implicit solvers. And this has some limitations in terms of parallelism, because once you start talking about implicit solvers, you start talking about preconditioners, and then you start talking about global coupling, where a lot of data needs to get transferred at each time step. If we compare FR to the finite volume method, there are high order extensions like Weno5, for example, but these are particularly challenging to implement around things like general boundaries. And another disadvantage of the finite volume method is parallelism. So with finite volume, when you increase the order of accuracy, you inherently increase the amount of parallel communication. And FR does the exact opposite. So with FR, if you increase the polynomial degree, so increase the order of accuracy, the relative amount of parallel communication actually goes down. So with FR, as you go to higher order, parallel communication goes down. So this is really why we want to focus on FR as our spatial discretization. So that's one aspect of this work. I mean, I'm not going to go into all the details of the FR approach, but that's kind of give you a high level of what we're doing in space. Really what we're focusing on in this talk is the temporal discretization. So again, we start with our PDE. We rearrange to solve for our conserved variables. As I mentioned, there are two mathematical operations we need to do here. One is integrating in time, and the other is differentiating in space, which was what we did with FR. So here what we're focusing on is the temporal term, and this essentially means we need some way of integrating our solution forwards in time from the initial condition to some final time t. So we need a way of numerically approximating these integrals. Typically there are two standard approaches. One is to use an explicit scheme, so for example an explicit Runge-Kutta method. These have a lot of advantages. Really, they're easy to implement. In a sense, relatively trivial to implement. They're scalable, so they require only local communication between neighboring elements across MPI ranks. So this means that they're highly scalable. They're suitable for modern hardware architectures because they require predominantly local compute. Essentially, most of the compute is done within each element. This makes them suitable for streaming hardware architectures like GPUs. And they also have a low cost per step. Basically, you just need to evaluate a few right-hand sides, and then you advance the solution in time. The main disadvantage of explicit schemes, and this is why a lot of commercial solvers avoid them, is because they have conditional stability limits. So this means that for a given problem, we have a maximum stable time step size that we can take, and if we exceed that, the solution will blow up. Now, if you need to take a larger time step, typically one would turn to an implicit scheme, because they have unconditional linear stability properties. So this means, at least in a linear sense, you can take an arbitrarily large time step. But there are a lot of challenges with implicit schemes. First of all, compared to explicit schemes, they're difficult to implement. You need to implement a global nonlinear solver as well as some kind of preconditioning. So typically we're talking about things like GMRes and ILU preconditioners. They have limited scalability in the preconditioning step in particular, where you have to invoke global communication. And all of this, these nonlinear solvers, etc., increase the cost per step. So by going from an explicit scheme to an implicit scheme, we gain unconditional linear stability, meaning we can take a large time step, but that time step is much more expensive and it's less scalable. So at least from a high level in this work, what I've assumed is that we would prefer an explicit approach because of the benefits that they have. But we need some way of alleviating the stability limitations, particularly in high Reynolds number flows. So on the bottom, what I've shown here is an example of a mesh around an airfoil. This is a NACA 0020. What you can see here in the far field and close to the surface of the airfoil is that all of the elements are relatively large, and a very small number of elements in the boundary layer here are what we require to be thin. So typically we're talking about maybe 1% or less of the elements are within this boundary layer region, but these are much, much smaller than the elements in the rest of the domain. As a result, these thin boundary layer elements, they limit our maximum step size. So we can't violate the CFL limit within these cells, which means that we need to take a really small delta t. In contrast, the vast majority, let's say 99% of the elements in the domain, are being run well below their stability limit. So we'll take a time step so that the boundary layer elements are, let's say, between 50 and maybe 80% of their maximum CFL number. And that means that all of these elements out here might be a fraction of that. They might be, 1% or less of their maximum CFL number. So what this means, at least from a high level, is you can see we're wasting a lot of compute. We're running all of these elements at a much smaller time step than stability requires. So what I want to show is on this plot, what I'm going to show is the time step size, so the maximum permissible time step size on the y-axis here, and the cost per time step. So if you look at an explicit scheme, this is sort of just to give you a high-level overview. An explicit scheme is really cheap per time step. So each delta t that we take is relatively cheap, but the time step size itself has to be small, okay? In contrast, for an implicit scheme, we can take a much larger time step size, maybe 10 or 100 or 1,000 times larger than an explicit scheme, but the cost of that time step is much larger because we need to generate preconditioners, we need to do nonlinear solves, Newton's method, all of this kind of stuff. So if we look at classical approaches, explicit or implicit methods, we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. Either we're limited by the time step size or we're limited by the cost per time step with an implicit method. Now what I'm going to be talking about in this work is what are called paired explicit Runge-Kutta methods. And what these are going to let us do is take a much larger time step size and actually introduce a lower cost per time step than a classical explicit scheme. Okay, so this is going to, if we look at this chart, okay, where we want to be is in the top left. We want a low cost per time step that lets us take a large time step size. And P-ERK schemes are going to let us move in that direction. So how do these work? Well, P-ERK schemes are fully explicit. Really, it's just a clever combination of different Runge-Kutta methods. And this means that they're relatively easy to implement. They're a little bit more difficult to implement than a classical explicit Runge-Kutta method, but much simpler to implement than a fully implicit scheme. As I mentioned, they're going to allow significantly larger time steps, and they're going to allow us to actually have a lower cost per step when compared to classical schemes. And combined, what this means is a larger delta t and a lower cost. This means that we get significant speed up factors. I'm going to show this for a few different examples at the end of this talk. So the basic idea with P-ERK schemes is, well, what would we like to do if we thought ideally, if we look at different classical Runge-Kutta methods, We would like to use Runge-Kutta methods with more stages in the boundary layer, so let's say like a 5, 6, 7 stage Runge-Kutta scheme, because they have improved stability. Basically, they allow a larger CFL number. And what we would like to do in contrast is use fewer stages in the far field to reduce cost. So for example, 2 or 3 stages in the far field to reduce cost. So why do we typically use the same RK scheme in the entire domain? Well, this is because we need to be careful about a few things. First of all, we need consistency. We need to make sure that our elements are advanced consistently in time. We need stability, so we need to make sure that we don't violate CFL limits or other kinds of stability constraints. We need convergence, so we need to make sure that it converges at the right or expected order of accuracy in time. And for conservation laws, we need to ensure that we have conservation. Things like mass, momentum, and energy are conserved. And these make it really tricky to use different RK schemes in different parts of the domain. Now, what we've done is we've introduced this new framework, the P-ERK framework, and what this really relies on is noticing something about Runge-Kutta methods. Basically, all explicit Runge-Kutta methods require 2 types of operations. One is accumulations, which are really cheap, and the other is right-hand side evaluations, which are expensive. So if we look at the butcher tableau for a classic RK44 here, what you can see is that this gets expanded out into a number of steps or stages. So we start with, for example, the evaluation of the stage 1 solution, then we evaluate the right-hand side of that solution, then we get the stage 2 solution, we evaluate the right-hand side, stage 3 solution, right-hand side, etc. Now the first type of operation we see is these accumulations, where we're basically just taking arrays and adding them to each other. So for example, to get the second stage solution, we need to take the array of the current time and add in the array of the right-hand side of U1. So these are just taking arrays and adding them to each other. This is quite cheap. What's expensive is getting the right-hand side. So when we have a stage solution and we have to get the residual or the right-hand side of that solution, that's expensive because that's where we need to invoke all of the flux reconstruction machinery, correction functions, Riemann solvers, derivatives of polynomials, etc. So typically, 90-95% of your compute is spent evaluating these right-hand sides, and 5% of less is spent in accumulating those to get the stage solutions. So this is one observation about explicit Runge-Kutta methods. So this is what drove the idea for P-ERK schemes, the basic idea is to generate families of compatible RK schemes. Now these RK schemes have to all have the same B and C vectors in their butcher tableau. And this is to make sure that they're consistent with each other, meaning that everything is evaluated consistently at the same stage times, and to ensure that we have conservation, meaning that things like mass, momentum, and energy are conserved. Now the trick with P-ERK schemes is that while we have the same B and C vector, we're going to use different A matrices. And some members of a P-ERK family will have what we call inactive stages, essentially stages where we're not going to evaluate the right-hand side. So we're going to essentially skip evaluating the right-hand side for a stage, reducing cost. The other thing is that combined A, B, and C must satisfy the internal and coupled order conditions. So this is to make sure we get the right orders of accuracy in time. So this is basically the idea. We want to generate compatible RK schemes that are consistent, conservative, and have the right orders of accuracy. But some of them will have what I mentioned as inactive stages that do not require a right-hand side evaluation. So let's look at an example pair of schemes. So what I've shown on the left here is the butcher tableau for a 4-stage P-ERK scheme. What you can see is that we have our C vector here, which is linearly distributed between 0 and 1/2. And we have our B vector here, which is all zeros and 1. And then we have these unknown coefficients, which I've labeled with question marks. Basically, these are in the first column of the A matrix and along the lower diagonal of the A matrix, and everything between the first column and the lower diagonal is taken to be 0. So let's expand out what we would do for this butcher tableau. So we would compute the first stage solution, get its right-hand side, second stage solution, get its right-hand side, and so on, and then finally update the solution to ut plus 1 using the current solution, and then delta t times the right-hand side of the last stage. Now what we can do is compare this butcher tableau with this butcher tableau, and the difference between these is all that I have done is eliminated this unknown. I've set this unknown to 0. Now if we expand out what we're going to do for this butcher tableau, you'll see that we follow the same sequence of steps, but this delta t times k2 is gone. Okay, we're missing this delta t times k2 because we've zeroed it out here. Now what you'll notice is that actually the right-hand side from k2 is never required. Okay, so the right-hand side of the second stage solution is never required. So that means we just don't need to compute it. We're never going to require it. So we'll get our u2, but we won't evaluate k2. We're just going to skip evaluating this. Okay, so you can see that while this scheme required evaluating 4 right-hand sides, this scheme required evaluating only 3 right-hand sides. Right? But importantly, because they have the same b and c vector, they can be paired with each other. So we could use this in part of the domain, let's say where the solution is non-stiff, and this in another part of the domain where the solution is stiff. So with a scheme with n stages, so let's say this 4-stage scheme, we can have between 2 and n active stages. So in this case of a 4-stage scheme, we can have 2, 3, or 4 active stages. And all of these schemes are compatible. So here's the original scheme. By introducing a 0 in this location, we no longer needed to evaluate k2. And additionally, we could generate another compatible tableau where we introduce another 0 for this unknown, and we no longer need to evaluate k3. So this is a scheme with 4 active stages, requires 4 right-hand side evaluations. This requires 3 right-hand side evaluations. This requires 2 right-hand side evaluations, and all of them are compatible with each other. Okay, so we can use them in different parts of the domain depending on stiffness. So how do we get these unknown coefficients? I just put them as question marks. Well, first of all, based on the definition of C, we can reduce them. So what I'm going to do is just plug in, switch the question marks for the row and column number for the coefficients. And then we know that the C vector, each entry of the C vector needs to be equal to the sum, the row sum of A. So this lets us reduce the number of unknowns by 1 in each row. And we're left with 2 unknowns here. For example, A32 and A43. So these are 2 unknowns, and we need to figure out what those are going to be in the butcher tableau. In general, for n active stages, we're going to have n minus 2 of these unknowns. So the way that we do this is by looking at the stability polynomial of the scheme. So if I look at the 2 active stage scheme, the stability polynomial pops out like this, which makes sense because it has no unknowns, and it should be second order accurate. And this is a second order accurate stability polynomial. If we look at the 3 active stage scheme, we'll see that that unknown pops out in the z cubed term of the stability polynomial. And if we look at the 4 active stage scheme, you can see that the A43 and A32 again pop out in the higher order terms of the stability polynomial. And what we see is that, let's say we have a 10-stage scheme with 10 active stages, we get the same kind of structure where we get like the last unknown and then the last unknown times the second last unknown, and on and on and on. And so this is what we're going to use. We're basically going to try to optimize these stability polynomials. So the more active stages we have, the more terms we have in the stability polynomial. And by providing a stability polynomial, we can solve for the unknowns in the tableau. Okay, so we have our Runge-Kutta stability polynomial. It's going to be some, some expanded polynomial. We take those coefficients and we can solve for the unknowns in the butcher tableau. Now, one of the ideas here is that the stability polynomials that we're going to use are optimal. Optimal in the sense that they're going to let us take the largest time step size for a given number of active stages. So I'm not going to get into all the details of how we do this optimization, but basically what you need to do is you have your spatial eigenspectra generated via von Neumann analysis. So this is kind of a well-known technique to get the Fourier footprint or eigenspectra of your scheme. And when we have this, in order for an explicit scheme to be stable, we have to take this spectra, scale it by the time step size, and it needs to fit within the region of stability of the Runge-Kutta method. So here are some example regions of stability for first order Euler all the way up to a 6-stage fifth order scheme. So you can see in order to get this to fit inside, for example, the first order Euler scheme, we need to multiply it by a really small time step size. In contrast, we could multiply it by a larger time step size and it would still fit within the 6-stage fifth order. Okay. But we don't have to use these stability polynomials, we can generate our own. So how does this work? Well, from the Butcher tableau, we can get the stability polynomial. Okay, we just use this expansion based on the A, B, and C terms. And in order for our scheme, in order to define the region of stability for this stability polynomial, this is the region where its absolute value is less than or equal to 1, basically saying the amplification factor in time is less than or equal to 1. And this is what's going to define our stability region. Okay. So what we can do is design optimal stability polynomials for a given stage count. What we're trying to do is find the maximum delta t while maintaining temporal accuracy. And this can be cast as a convex optimization problem. So we're going to try to find the maximum delta t, basically maximize our time step size for a given number of active stages by changing the coefficients in the stability polynomial. Now it turns out this is non-convex, which means it's a challenging optimization problem. But from work from David Ketcheson's group, he's shown that this non-convex optimization can be split into two parts, a convex part and an optimization as single variable, and both of these are somewhat trivial. So ultimately what this means is that we can get optimal stability polynomials in about 10 seconds. So if you give me if you do von Neumann analysis of your scheme and send me your eigenspectra, I can give you the optimal stability polynomial in about 10 seconds. And this is optimal in the sense that it has the maximum linearly stable time step size. So what does this look like? Well, if you start with an eigenspectra like this, let's say we stick this into the optimizer, this is the stability region, the Runge-Kutta stability region that it spits back, okay? And you can see that this shape exactly matches this shape. In fact, the stability region is shown in orange, and then the convex hull of the eigenspectra is shown here in red, and you can see the two match each other. So basically it's found the maximum delta t that can be achieved for the stability polynomial. So if you want to do this optimization, you can do it yourself, or you can just download this from the supplementary material of several of our papers. We've included all of these stability polynomials for FR and by extension DG schemes. Couple of notes. This can be, I've shown this as an example for a 4-stage with 4, 3, and 2 active stages, but this can be generalized to any number of stages. So you can have, for example, 16 stages with 16 active stages paired with a 16 stage with 2 active stages, let's say. Okay. All right. So here's an example of it being extended to, here is a 10 stage with, I think, 6 active stages. Additionally, some recent work we've been doing is on embedded pairs. So we've been able to generate embedded pairs, which means we can do things like adaptive time stepping with PID controllers. So we don't need to find the maximum time step manually. The time step can actually evolve in time as the solution evolves. And additionally, it can be extended to third order in time. My former PhD student, now postdoc Siavash, has shown that we can extend the P-ERK approach to third order accuracy. So in summary, if you want to use P-ERK schemes, you basically choose the maximum number of stages that you want to use. So this is the number of active stages you're going to have in, let's say, the boundary layer. So as an example, you might choose 16 active stages in the boundary layer. And then you choose intermediate schemes with fewer active stages. So they still have 16 total stages, but let's say only 2 stages where you evaluate the right-hand side, 4 and 8 where you evaluate the right-hand side. So the 16 active stages you're going to use in the boundary layer, 8 you're going to use in smaller elements, 4 you're going to be using larger elements, and 2 you're going to use in, let's say, the largest elements in the domain. Now you've got your butcher tableaus with the corresponding numbers of active stages. You generate your optimal stability polynomials, and then you solve for the unknowns in the A matrix. So you can do these 4 steps yourself, or as I mentioned, you can just download the butcher tableaus from the supplementary material in our papers. So we've done all of this work for you. All you have to do is download the A, B, and C terms. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our implementation of these P-ERK schemes, and then I'm going to show you some examples. So we've implemented these in our solver HORUS. This is the High-ORder Unstructured Solver. So we're developing HORUS at my group at Concordia. Currently it can solve several different types of systems, so linear advection, diffusion, Euler equations, as well as incompressible or compressible Navier-Stokes. As I mentioned, our spatial discretization uses the high-order flux reconstruction approach in space, which has been extended to linear, quad, tri, prism, tet, and hex elements. We have several different types of time stepping that we can do, so explicit, implicit, IMEX, AMEX, as well as what I'm talking about here, which is these P-ERK schemes. We have adaptive time stepping through embedded pairs and PID controllers. We can do gradient-free and gradient-based optimization of steady problems as well as LES or DNS. We can do fluid structure interaction, so we can have moving and deforming domains through an ALE formulation. And all of this is implemented in a combination of C++ and Kutta, which means we can run on CPUs and GPUs, and parallelism through MPI. So here are a few examples of HORUS. So this is an example of a mixing layer. So you've got here in red a fluid moving from right to left, and then on the top in blue a fluid moving from left to right in red and from right to left in blue. And then you can see the interface where these two fluids mix together. Here's another example of a buoyancy-driven flow where we've got a heated plate on the bottom and a cooled plate on top. This is with an incompressible solver where we're here using a passive scaler to trace the mixing of the cool and hot regions of the fluid as they're driven by a gravitational force. It's an example of a vertical axis wind turbine. So here you're taking a top-down view of a slice through a vertical axis wind turbine. You can see the vortices that are shed by each blade of the turbine and how they interact with each other downstream. It's not shown here, but this is actually an adaptive simulation, so the solver is tracking these regions of vorticity and using high solution polynomial degrees in those regions where the flow is rapidly evolving. You can also handle different types of flows, for example, transonic or supersonic flows. Here we have a shock wave over a triangular wedge. This is what's known as Chardin's experiment. You can see that we match very nicely the experiment in terms of the location of these roll-up vortices as well as the shape of these kind of secondary shock wave type reflections that we get in the wake behind the wedge. As I mentioned, we can also do optimization. So this is an animation showing optimization of an airfoil. On the top left and middle, we've got different optimization parameters. What we're trying to optimize here in the top right is the lift to drag ratio of this airfoil. And we have several different design parameters which are shown in the bottom right here, how we're tracing through the design space. So here you can see we start with a NACA 0012, and as this optimization progresses, you can see the deformed shape where we've the optimal airfoil has more of kind of a cambered profile. HORUS is also, as I mentioned, can be applied on both GPUs and CPUs. So here's an example of GPU scaling on NVIDIA V100 GPUs. So you can see we scale by about a factor of 20 to 30. strong scaling, and here on the right is scaling on CPUs, where we scale, somewhat indefinitely here up to about a factor of at least 100 or maybe 200 in terms of scaling on CPUs. All right, so let's get back to the PERK schemes that we've implemented in HORUS. The first thing I want to show is some verification. So, I said that these could be paired with each other using arbitrary combinations of the numbers of active stages. So here's an example of an isentropic vortex. It's got an exact analytical solution. And what we're going to do is take our mesh. So here's the computational mesh. It's got periodic boundaries. So this vortex is going to go kind of start here in the middle and travel out the top and come back in the bottom. And what I've done is randomly distributed the active stages. So we've got 10 total stages, but randomly distributed between 2 and 10 active stages. And that's what the color is showing here, is that we just randomly picked how many active stages we're going to put in each location. Here's the convergence. So in the black line through yellow line in circles, what you're seeing is a simulation with constant number of active stages, let's say 2 active stages everywhere, up to 10 active stages everywhere, and then a random distribution shown with the squares, and we get almost exactly the expected convergence rate. Now let's talk about speed up factors. So here's flow over a cylinder. We have a adaptive 4-stage second order scheme, as well as our PERK scheme. You can see that PERK gets us a speed up of up to 7x. Here's an example of a plunging and pitching airfoil. We've got a NACA 0012. Here's a zoom of the boundary layer, and you can see the number of active stages here. We've got 16 active stages, 8 and 3. Here are the results with adaptive classical RK method and adaptive PERK. You can see the vorticity contours are nearly identical. We get some kind of minor variations here further downstream, but that's expected because the flow is chaotic. The lift and drag curves as function of time are right on top of each other. And again, we get speed up factors in excess of 7. Here's an example of flow over a stalled NACA 0012. So this is a LES simulation. And you can see, again, we get speed up factors on the order of 7x by switching to PERK. Now, we can also look at scaling studies. So on the left here is a scaling of PERK schemes on an A100 GPU, on A100 GPUs from NVIDIA. And on the right is a classical ERK scheme and its strong scaling. So what you can see is that the classical ERK schemes scale a little bit better, a fair bit better than the PERK schemes. When we're on one GPU, in both cases, we're above 50% of peak performance. So there's a small penalty on one GPU for using PERK. But if we think about the speed up factor, so if we look at that one GPU, it's about 5 times faster, 5 to 6 times faster, let's say, than the classical ERK method, which means that with one GPU using PERK, we get about the performance of 8 GPUs using a classical explicit Runge-Kutta method. Additionally, if we go to up to 2 GPUs, we get about the performance of 16 GPUs using a classical explicit Runge-Kutta method. And if we go up to 4 GPUs using PERK, we're beyond kind of the strong scaling limit of classical explicit Runge-Kutta methods. So in conclusion, PERK schemes enable us to perform explicit solutions of stiff problems. They let us take a larger time step size and are cheaper per time step. They're suitable for locally stiff problems such as boundary layers, and we've shown speed up factors in excess of 7x for things like LES and DNS. They result in a significant reduction in hardware requirements for both CPUs and GPUs, and all of this material is available as ESM. You can just download the Butcher tableaus from our papers. So I'll just acknowledge several of the people who've worked with me on HORUS and are looking at different aspects of its development, all of my graduate students and postdocs, and everyone who's funded this work. Okay, thank you.